Welcome to Chautauqua Lake from 1945 to present. I do not have a map of Chautauqua Lake in 1945, but I do have one that has a base information starting in 1954. This is a 7.5-minute quadrangle map, and it shows you Chautauqua Lake and its watershed. By 1954, we have a substantial portion of the shoreline of the lake under development. Such things are still missing, however, as Sealand Drive going from the Wayland Street and around to the big inlet. We've got tremendous amount of development up the big inlet. We've got partial development into what was the swamp on the 1904 map. And as we come down the shore, we have place after place with development. Chautauqua Institution, of course, is spread out. We now have the development Chautauqua Shores, the development in the vicinity of the Pendergast Fish Hatchery, and on down and around the lake. And even in the Tom's Point, which is shown on the map as a wetlands, we have development taking place. And all the way down, you can see a thin line of about 1 lot depth development down the shores of the lake till you get to Viewcoat, which was shown on the 1904 map as a swamp, is now an intensely developed area. And we can go up this other side of the lake in the same manner. In 1992, I did an estimation of the shoreline that was undeveloped on Chautauqua Lake, and we flipped the numbers from 1904, or the turn of the century, where there was 7 miles of developed shoreline. We now have 7 miles of undeveloped shoreline. The biggest property owners around the shores of the lake, the biggest property owner on the shores of Chautauqua Lake, is the state of New York with the Long Point State Park and the fish hatchery, and the recent purchase of the rest of Tom's Point and the wetland that is there. Purchased because they felt that this was a very important Muskellunge spawning area on the lake. And we'll get into that in more detail at a later time. We also have behind me some aerial photography that was taken in April and May of this year, and it would help you to understand the development pattern again. Here's the village of Mayville. Here's the New York State Department of Transportation and the Chautauqua malted plant with its ponds. And this has a very interesting history that we may spend some time on, because this little inlet at one point is 28% of the phosphorus loading of Chautauqua Lake. The other photograph that we have here is the Chautauqua Bemis area, Long Point State Park, part of a terminal. This whole area is part of a terminal moraine system. Got beautiful, beautiful sands in Tom's Point, along the edges of the state park, Bemis Point, and of course Oriental Park. The Oriental Park has been growing since the turn of the century. No public water supply to date. However, we do have a sewer system there now. Down to the other end of the lake, High Acres Mobile Home Park, the Ellery Town Line, the junkyard that is right across from the Flavanna Elementary School, which is now a resource center facility. And if you look back far enough into Bonita, you see again mostly linear development until you get to Point Stockholm and Sheldon Hall and Dutch Hollow Creek. This is the most active growing delta on the lake, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But the development basically that has taken place through this period of time is 1 lot deep. I like to refer to it as the first 250 feet of the shoreline of the lake. Realize that up until 1965, the only regulations that were enforced dealing with Chautauqua Lake were those that were enforced by the local health officer. And they were not necessarily well enforced. The fact of the matter is that Dr. Gunkler of WCA Hospital in Jamestown headed a committee shortly after I came to Chautauqua County to talk about the pollution of Chautauqua Lake. And it was absolutely amazing, the places that we went to. I can remember going to Point Stockholm and opening a manhole cover and looking to where the outfall went, and it went right straight out into the lake, right from the manhole. I can remember going to a canal in Oriental Park that absolutely reeked. That's a nice description of it. The activity and pressure for development of the lake continues to expand, but until the health department comes along in 1965, there is no regulation as to how a person is to install a sewer system around the shores of the lake. I'm going to sit myself down here for a few minutes so I can get closer to this outline. It's easier to read that way. We have people beginning to be concerned about the elevation of the lake in the summertime. The Lake Association writes a paper. Nothing is done about it, but there is a pleading. We have this Chautauqua Lake Association now is in the forefront as the keeper of the lake, along with the state of New York. They're playing games with the aquatic vegetation of the lake, and the state starts out by using arsenic compounds to control the weeds, and then we get into sophisticated chemicals such as diquat 2,4-D, and the lake rooted aquatic vegetation is bothering us. We're in conflict with it. We're having an algae blooms, and we're not happy with it. We also have a incident of flooding again, and the Corps of Engineers, the politics of this, I believe, is that Dan Reed was the chairman of the House Appropriations Committee, and he had no great project in his district, and the Corps of Engineers is going to give him one. And they come up with a 1995 report in the 84th Congress on a proposal to eliminate the flooding in Chautauqua Lake. Now, believe it or not, it includes everything that was in the 1944 report. It says, open the Chautauqua River from the boat landing to the dam so that we can control the flow out of the lake better. It says, don't build in the floodplain of the lake. It says, have a lake regulation scheme. And then the Corps of Engineers does an interesting thing, and it's mentioned back in the hydrological section. They do a write-up of the maximum possible storm that could hit Chautauqua Lake and what would happen to the waters of the lake. And we're talking about 23 inches of rain in a 36-hour period, with the lake rising up to an elevation of 1319. Now that's 11 feet above the normal summer elevation. That's the maximum storm, okay? A frightening contemplation, absolutely. And I'll tell you why later in some of the work that we do on the lake during these years. They also then say, because of this, and because of the standard project storm, we need, in order to guarantee safety in the flooding areas of the lake, we need to build a channel out of the lake in the vicinity of the Little Inlet up through the Continental Divide to empty into Little Chautauqua Creek. And of course, today you wouldn't even contemplate that because of the environmental questions that would be raised, but at that point there was no environmental constraint of that type. There was a lot of emotion spent on that project. A lot of people were for it. A lot of people questioned whether or not the cost-benefit analysis had been done correctly. Let me give you an example. If there was a storm and a lake crest on March 15th at, we'll say, 1312, and then it dropped down to 1310.4 and rose again to 1312 a week later, my Oriental rug and radio that was lying on the floor of my cottage was counted both times in the cost-benefit analysis. I testified at a hearing where I was finally gavelled down that if we took out those types of duplication, instead of there being a positive cost-benefit analysis, for every dollar we spent, we were only going to get 88 cents worth of benefit, which meant that the project should not go forward. 1955, we get into the scramble of that. We also get involved with the into the Gunkler Committee. Sometime in the early 60s, somebody reintroduces the walleye pike to Chautauqua Lake. There are a number of stories about that. I don't know which of them are true. I have advanced one of them because I know some people that brought 5-gallon pails of walleye fry up from Lake Erie and put them in the lake. But whether or not that is an absolute truth is open to the mythology of Chautauqua Lake, and we'll leave it right there. During this period of time, in the mid-60s, all of a sudden we get a group that say, hey, we ought to look at a Public Law 566 watershed program for Chautauqua Lake. It would be much more beneficial. It would help us hold our summer lake elevations. It would help us regulate the lake better. We could take the crest off the flooding. We could lower the siltation rates in the lake. We could have a better summer on the lake. Cost-benefit analysis was looked at. The Agriculture Department said that there was not enough siltation taking place in the general watershed of the lake to put in retention ponds for sedimentation purposes. And then somebody made the mistake of saying, and the greatest contributor to siltation of Chautauqua Lake are the dairy farmers of the watershed that are still allowing their cows to walk in the streams and churn up the bottom of the streams, and of course immediately the stream tries to level that out. And all of a sudden the fervor started to melt in the community. We of course are deeply involved in a chemical war on the lake. The next thing that is of excitement that comes along, we now have regulation of development around the shores of the lake. All of the towns and villages on Chautauqua Lake now have building code regulations, minimum lot sizes. The health department is enforcing sewage disposal. I would suggest to you that when the first studies were done by Dr. Erlandson and others in the 60s, when they pinpointed, that's not the right word, when they documented the great amount of sewage that was going into the lake from individual systems, the vast majority of them have been corrected. We no longer put sewage directly into the lake in any amount or quantity. Federal flood insurance comes along in 1969, which says thou shalt not build in the normal floodplain or the 100-year floodplain. It says you will not build in the floodplain, and then it makes recommendations related to the 100-year floodplain. And finally, all of the local governments take that into their regulation ordinance system because if they don't, the people of their community don't qualify for federal flood insurance. Our next benchmark that we look at is Tropical Storm Agnes in June of 1972, a very interesting fickle storm that came up and straddled parts of New York State and gave us an inordinately high amount of rain, gave us some flooding, but not the worst in recent memory. And from that program, we received enough funds to do a study as to whether or not the gauge on Chautauqua Lake at its location at that time was in the right place, and whether or not we ought to have a new gauging station. We end up with a gauge run at the north end of the lake, at the center of the lake, and the south of the lake for a year. And when the report comes in, we conclude that we ought to build a gauging station at Bemis Point, and maybe we'll go out and look at that gauging station in a field trip. So we now have a gauging station at Bemis Point. There is a gauging station at the outlet of the lake down at Dow Street in the city of Jamestown. And we've had this terrible storm. And we have floodplain maps created around the shores of the lake and in any place where the 1310-foot contour line is more than 50 feet back from the shore. We have mapped it. That information is available in the county planning department. 1970 to 1975, we have an organization that's created to study the Allegheny River Basin and its water resources. And from that committee, which was chaired by Merle Smedberg, who was then the director of the City of Jamestown Board of Public Utilities, comes a regulation scheme for Chautauqua Lake, something that was recommended in 1955 and something that was recommended in 1944. And they come up with a regulation scheme. Every morning, the person that operates Warner Dam looks at the lake elevation and what the weather forecast is going to be, and he decides whether or not to do something to Warner Dam. Now realize that Warner Dam has a capacity of 6,000 cubic feet per second. However, you can only put 1,720 cubic feet per second down the river, and they start stressing the people in the village of Faulkner. So this scheme is put together to try and take the lake down as far as we possibly can in the winter, as low as we can possibly get it. The only problem with that is that the lower the lake gets, the more the flow is limited, because it is the elevation of the lake that dictates the flow between the boat landing and Warner Dam. It's not Warner Dam. Warner Dam only controls at the Warner Dam point. And we have the constriction above the 3rd Street Bridge. We can't do anything about it. If you remember, we were supposed to have that dredged out. We put the regulation scheme into existence, and it begins to operate. And if you were to look at the chart up on the wall or on the easel over here, at the recent years of it, you will find that we have very little in the way of flooding taking place after the 1976 implementation. But we do have the 76 storm, which is quite high. It exceeds the 100-year storm on the lake. And the reason for that is a spring freshet, and we'll talk about that for just a moment, because that's the year that I did an intensive study of the snowpack in the watershed of Chautauqua Lake, and went to the then chairman of the county executive, and to our emergency preparedness people, Wanda Gustafson, and said, we're going to have a flood. And the question is, how should we share it? Do we share it by keeping it up on the lake, or do we put it down the river? And what happened was that the flood of March of 1976 put water around 845 homes in mostly the lower reaches of the lake. The Corps of Engineers insisted there was one basement flooded, but I couldn't find that when I sent a field team out to investigate it. The flood takes place. It enforces people's thinking about using federal flood insurance. It becomes important to implement the building codes even more aggressively than we have in the past. The next important thing that happens, a whole series of things tumbled through the 70s and the 80s. 1975, the Chautauqua County Sewer Agency is created. County government could not be involved in the sewer business until about that time, and then it could only be involved in the creation of a sewer system if it was serving areas of more than 2 municipalities. So in 1975, the County Sewer Agency is created, and immediately the North Chautauqua Lake Sewer District, the Center Chautauqua Lake Sewer District, and the South Chautauqua Lake Sewer District are created. And we go into engineering studies. And we get estimates that are going to cost us millions upon millions of dollars. At that particular time, the federal and state aid was down around about 50%. And when we got the numbers they were very, very high. And the financing costs were very expensive. However, the impetus of the Gunkler study that had been done in the 60s was still there. The health department had closed a number of our beaches a number of different times because of coliform count. Sewer plants were overflowing at surcharge during spring freshets and storms. And we began to move on those. There's a whole history to be found on that. I'm not going to go into the details. There were a series of accusations. There was some misengineering. Some people forgot to remember the geological history of the lake. We forgot that stone wasn't immediately available. Where we thought stone was at 65 feet, it was at 165 feet, and we went through organic silts. In some instances, sewer lines could not be constructed as gravity flow systems. And so when we look at the center and the north and the South Chautauqua Lake Sewer District, we see a very selection of technologies used, including force mains, including pump grinders, extensive lines. Interestingly enough, and something that I'm very proud of, was that at the time Bill Parment was working with me, and we did a schematic study of the sewers that were needed in the center and the South Chautauqua Lake Sewer District. And when the final funding came through for those districts, only 2,000 feet of the line that Bill and I suggested were needed were not qualified for federal grant programs, which to me was just an excellent piece of work, basically on Bill's part at that time. One of the things that happened is we look forward to spending tens of millions of dollars in these sewer systems. And how did we finance them? Well, fortunately, at that particular time, and up until they were all online in about 1982, we received grants ranging, depending upon an element of the system or the whole system, anywhere from 66.5% to 87.5% in state and federal grants. So this allowed the cost of sewers basically to stay under $400 a year for the people in these districts. At one point, the Center Chautauqua Lake Sewer District was going to have its own sewage plant. I happened to be on the sewer board at that time, and I asked the engineering firm to estimate what it would cost for us to join the South Chautauqua Lake Sewer District, and how much more would it be for the people in Center Chautauqua Lake Sewer District a year. The cost came up somewhere between $5 and $6 a year. I therefore moved with Dick Evans as chairman of the Center Chautauqua Lake Sewer District that we not build a Center Chautauqua Lake Sewer District plant, but rather go to the South Chautauqua Lake Sewer District. And that's the way it happened. And that's about what the cost differential was. And for the Center Chautauqua Lake Sewer District, for parts of it, we got 3% financing for a number of years. As we go through the 80s, we find more and more development taking place on the lake. Interestingly enough, something that you don't think would affect the lake happens, and that's the Agricultural Act. The National Agricultural Act, I don't know its exact title, of 1985, which had a dairy buyout in it and dynamically reduced the number of cattle in the Chautauqua Lake watershed. We then almost lost the Muskellunge in Chautauqua Lake in the 1980s. Realized that the walleye pike, of course, came in the early 60s. Why the population shrank, we don't absolutely know. We know that, however, that the female Muskellunge at 32 inches possibly had not spawned yet, or maybe only spawned once, and we were allowed to keep her. And so the state of New York said, hey, one of the things that we're going to do is we're going to make sure that the female Muskellunge has an opportunity to spawn several times before she's taken out of the lake. So now they tell us that the smallest fish we can take is 40 inches long. Have you ever tried to disconnect from a 38-inch Muskellunge and not harm yourself or the fish? Welcome to a very rare experience. During the early 70s, the Chautauqua County Legislature, under the leadership of Joseph Gerasi as county executive, begins the Chautauqua Lake Benchmark Studies, which is a series of studies to update the Allegheny River Basin report of the 1937. And we have a team of people from the State College at Fredonia and from the Jamestown Community College doing extensive studies to update this report and to give us a new understanding of Chautauqua Lake as it exists in the 70s. We're having terrible, terrible algae blooms on the lake, fearsome algae blooms. People are repulsed from the lake in June because of the algae blooms. 1975, the Chautauqua malted milk plant shuts down. 1976, the weed community at the north end of the lake goes through a dynamic change, and the monofilament, not monofilament, Myriophyllum almost disappears as opposed to being acres and acres of surface floating weeds in the previous years. We then, the Lake Association is still deeply involved in using chemicals on the lake. There is an upset time about the use of chemicals. Whether or not it had anything to do with the loss of the Muskellunge, who knows? And finally one day, under a new administration, John Glenser calls me up and he says, John, I want you to come meet with Larry Nelson and John Spagnoli of DEC. Got a little job for you. And they handed to me at lunch at Bemis Point, the Italian fishermen, the challenge of creating an aquatic vegetative management plan as an amendment to the aquatic vegetation control program of the state of New York. We bring in the refugettes, Mark and Kelly. They become part of the staff to work on that. Kelly is still in the county planning department. We go through 2 years with a moratorium on the use of any chemicals on the lake. We go through a series of public meetings with a citizens advisory body and with a technical advisory panel, and we come up with a proposal for influencing the aquatic vegetation in the lake. People are not happy with the report. An organization called Save Our Lake Environment is brought into existence by people that are opposed to the use of any chemicals on the lake, and they play an interesting role in the final shaping of the plan and its implementation. The plan is completed in 1990. It goes through its environmental impact statement hearings. It's adopted, and it becomes the guiding tool for the Chautauqua Lake Association and its use of aquatic vegetation control chemicals. 1992, 1994, there is another study instituted on the lake concerning the nutrient budget. And possibly at a later date, I'll be able to bring Kelly Refugek and Mike Wilson from the State College at Fredonia up, and we can talk about where the nutrient loading from Chautauqua Lake into the lake, where is it coming from? I'll give you this clue. It's the spring freshet and the general storms of the watershed. It's not from the, while the sewage treatment plants are now secondary plants where 85% of the solids are settled out, there's still chemistry going into the lake. But the watershed is the major contributor, and whether or not we were to go to advanced technology in our sewage treatment plants, we would change the quality of the water any further or not is open to question, and we'll find out about it by 1966. And maybe we can come back and do a whole session on our new understanding of the lake. That program is being done with a large citizen advisory committee, and the Lake Association and the Chautauqua Lake Conservancy are involved with it, as well as the Chautauqua Lake Association. It's our lake. It's up to you and I to decide how and when we will be happy with the quality of the water in the lake and our use of it. It's yours and my responsibility. I invite you to join us in the years to come as we struggle with being respectful of the lake. And the next session we'll talk about the future of Chautauqua Lake. We're going to look at the future of Chautauqua Lake today and see what the future holds for the lake. We have a number of topics, a number of items to to discuss. We'll start by looking at the shape of the watershed, because this is going to play the most dynamic role in what happens to the future of the lake. What happens within each of these watersheds? You can see here the size of the Goose Creek watershed, the size of the Prendergast watershed, the size of the DeWittville watershed, the size of the Big Inlet watershed. As we look at these watersheds, there's one thing to keep in mind. Most of the watersheds from the Big Inlet around along the westerly shore of the lake down to and including Goose Creek has sub-basins with long, low gradients in each of the streams. When we move to the east side of the watershed and get into DeWittville Creek, Maple Springs, Bemis, and Dutch Hollow Creek, we run into much steeper watersheds, a heritage of the geological history, and we have a different set of erosion equations for these streams along this side. Probably the first thing that we're concerned about when we look at the watershed and the future of the lake itself is what is the nutrient loading going to be? And we're going to look at two sources of nutrient loading: the watershed itself, the activities in the watershed, and then cultural activities around the shores of the lake. Probably the greatest change, there are going to be two great changes take place. One is going to be in the watershed in general, and then there's going to be intensive activity in all of these small, minor watersheds, basically between the perimeter road or the peripheral roads around the lake and the lake itself. So we'll talk about those two parts. The watershed in general. Aerial photography dating back to 1937 and 38 up to this year shows us that there is a dynamic change taking place in the general watershed and in the majority of the 180 square miles of the watershed. The change is back to brush and woodlands. Farming is disappearing from the watershed, with one exception. We have the Amish people up in this corner there that are aggressively farming, but they farm in a different manner than we've seen generally in the watershed. Acres upon acres of land are no longer tilled. Acres and acres of land, we're talking about thousands of acres of land, are no longer pastured. The Agricultural Act of 1985 has taken a lot of the dairy farms out of the watershed. There are still literally a handful of big dairy farms in the watershed, and that's it. Farming activities, the farmer has become a much more alert person in how he uses his resources. He doesn't use fertilizer the way he did a decade ago. He applies manure in a different manner than he did a decade ago. And those things are all going to be positive as far as the lake itself is concerned. Remember the lake and the retention period in the lake. Water retention in the upper basin, 526 days. Water retention in the lower basin, 105 days. And if you look at some of the chemical concentrations that we've done in some of our studies, you find that as you go down lake, chemical concentrations increase as if you're dealing with a huge sugaring pan. When one makes maple syrup, the concentration gets of chemistry, biological activity, etc., increases as you come down lake. So in terms of nutrient loading, we're going to have a plus factor in the vast majority of the area. By plus, I mean the nutrient loading is going to be reduced. The challenge area is going to be near shore, where we have cultural activities, in the operation of sewage treatment plants, in the addition of additional sewage disposal facilities. However, the rules and regulations that exist today and the sewer systems that exist today realize that all of the sewage from this point, which is Asheville Bay, all the way around the lake and all the way up the lake to Midway Park, all of the sewage that is generated in the center and the South Chautauqua Lake Sewer District is now discharged in the outlet of the lake. We then have a major sewage treatment plant at Mayville serving a northern portion of the lake and the Chautauqua Institution plant. And then we have sewer plants at private developments, such as Crosswind, Shedwells, but these all meet standards that didn't exist in 1965. And therefore, the contribution in terms of total nutrient loading, if these plants are operated correctly and the new plants that would be added are operated correctly, there will not be a significant increase back to historic levels that we had years ago. Sedimentation. Sedimentation rates, basically it depends upon which one of these streams you want to talk about and what is happening in the streams. Dutch Hollow Creek has the highest gradient of any of the streams feeding into Chautauqua Lake. It has the most aggressive growing delta of the streams in the watershed. Farming, for all practical purposes, there's very, very little plowing done in this watershed anymore. I don't know that there's a major farm left in the Dutch Hollow Creek watershed. Go back 20 years and you have an entirely different picture. So is the case along this side of the watershed. We have sedimentation rates that will decline as agricultural activity declines. However, there's one thing to be remembered about sedimentation in Chautauqua Lake. We can talk about averages, and I believe that the average sedimentation rate is somewhere in the neighborhood of 0.02 of an inch per year. However, you can get an epic storm. If you remember the storm that flooded the Lakewood Mall not too many years after it was developed, that storm only was in that single little small watershed. It wasn't reflected anyplace else in the watershed. Then several years ago, we had that storm that took out the bridge in Panama. That storm was represented in these three watersheds, basically the Prendergast Ball Creek and the Goose Creek watershed. And they deposited significant amounts of sedimentation into the lake at their mouths. Then I have the record in 1982 of a 2-inch rainstorm that lasted 1 hour up in the DeWittville, Big Inlet, Mud Creek, Little Inlet, and Lighthouse watershed. It was not reflected anyplace else in the watershed. Those can create, with each of those storms, quite a bit of sediment loading. But when you average it out, we're talking about a very, very low rate. When you talk about sediment, you talk about erosion. Again, because of the land use pattern that is taking place, erosion rates are going down. And all of the governments around the shores of Chautauqua Lake now have a cooperative agreement of one form or another with the Ag Center. It used to be called the Soil and Water Conservation District, but I think they've changed the title, to work with them when there is a development of any significance that takes place. Ellery, Busti, Lakewood, North Harmony, and Chautauqua. Realize what Fran Morgan and the town board of the town of Ellicott did with the development of the Wegmans and the Kmart site. They have a stormwater retention basin for two purposes, so that this runoff doesn't flood people downstream and also to pick up sediment. So we do have already guidelines and suggestions by people of Chautauqua County that they are interested in the future of the lake, and they're doing something about it. The great unknown in Chautauqua Lake is a new addition. It's the zebra mussel. What the zebra mussel is going to portend for the lake, we don't know. If it is going to act like it did in the Great Lakes, it's going to give us clearer water. But the question again being, the hydraulics of the lower lake, is the zebra mussel going to be powerful enough to take out the algae bloom in August in the lower lake? I doubt it, but only time will tell. Another challenge that we have for those of us that spend time on the lake is the fishing resource. I have talked with a number of people, and we have a number of fishing organizations, some oriented to the bass, some oriented to the muskellunge, and many of those people that belong to those organizations now do a catch and release. But every once in a while, you get something that you want to take home. I would suggest to you that the smallmouth bass fishing, the largemouth bass fishing on the lake has changed in the 40 years that I have known the lake. The competition for those fish is much greater than it was 40 years ago. We now have a limit on almost every fish of any consequence in the lake except for the perch. And the sunfish, of course. But the other fish we have a limit on, and I think wisely so. I believe that the fishing resource will remain with us. But again, what is the zebra mussel going to do as it has been interjected into the food chain? Better yet, what has the walleye pike done? Because if we read the literature on the lake, we find that the walleye pike was not found in the 1937 study, but it was alluded to in that report. And of course, I've been eating walleye pike out of Chautauqua Lake since the early 1960s. We have the walleye pike that's in there now that we know about. We have a silver bass. We have several other introductions to the lake. But basically, for those of us that want to fish, if we understand how to fish for the particular fish that we're interested in, I believe that they will be here. They will be more difficult to catch. I usually averaged 15 hours for a keeper muskellunge when a muskellunge only had to be 32 inches. I've gone all the way up to 25 hours of fishing now before I get a 40-inch muskellunge that I may keep under the fishing regulations. Catch a lot of fish, turn a lot of them loose. The question is going to be the amount of competition that takes place. As we continue to promote the lake as a fishing resource and as a contest site, it may very well be that the number of fish that are available for us will be reduced, unless we get more and more involved in the fish and release programs that we see with some of the clubs that now fish Chautauqua Lake. Algae blooms. Any time we have a good spring freshet, the melting of the snow, any time we have a good rainstorm with high runoff, within several days of that incident, we begin to get an algae bloom. It's a combination of temperature and nutrient availability. The big storm runoffs and the spring freshets, those years that we have it, give us our major elements of our nutrient loading for the lake. And you can see that they get concentrated in various areas. So you're going to get a tremendous amount of nutrient loading off of the Goose Creek, off the Pendergast Creek. Realize that we have never been able to measure a flow through the lake. We've never had the resources to do a flow study, but we know about the retention calculations that can be made for each of these lakes. When you say 105 days or 106 days for the lower lake, realize that's averaged over the year. Remember that from April through to December 1st, we try to control the lake elevation and maintain the lake elevation. Therefore, most of the flows take place outside of those dates. In other words, from December 1st until about April 1st is when we get most of our flow out of the lake. Rooted aquatic plants. My first recollection of Chautauqua Lake deals with a series of bulrushes up in Hartfield Bay. And I can remember being out with my father-in-law and casting in amongst the bulrushes and having wonderful follow-ups of large muskellunge. I believe that people that have been on the lake for the last 20 years don't even know about the fact that there were bulrushes in the upper lake. Because of the fact that we have maintained a lake elevation program in the summer months, basically aggressively since 1976, and kind of before that, starting back in about 1960, we have changed the aquatic vegetation patterns within the lakes. These bulrushes are gone. There are a number of places where bulrushes used to be. They no longer exist. We only have a few places of lily pads and bulrushes. That's a combination of changing and maintaining a summer lake elevation, as well as our history of using some chemicals on the lake. By the way, in all instances that we use chemicals on the lake, they were done under a State Department of Environmental Conservation permit of one form or another. We've learned a lot about rooted aquatic plants as I've lived in Chautauqua County. We once thought that the rooted aquatics took most of their nutrient loading out of the water column. Then they changed and said, no, they take it out of the sediments. And now they're telling us, depending upon pH and temperature and the amount of light, the plants can be selective about when and where they take it. We also have the challenge that most of our rooted aquatics come up aggressively in the spring of the year and then kind of just grow through the rest of the year. The Lake Association is harvesting these plants. Milfoil used to be the villain. If we go back a decade and look at the amount of material that was taken out of the lake by the Lake Association, we would find that an extremely high percentage of the plant taken out was milfoil. In talking with the executive director of the Lake Association late this fall, he said that milfoil represented possibly 5% or less of the plants that were mowed. So we've had that type of change. With the nutrient loading as we have changed it, my estimation is a reduction of 55% or better of the phosphorus loading in the lake. We have changed the competition of the rooted aquatics in the lake. Depending upon what the zebra mussel does, if the zebra mussel is going to eat the algae and lock up the nutrient loading in such a manner that we have better sunshine penetration through various parts of the lake, basically the lower lake, we're going to find more area in the lower lake is going to become available to the growth of rooted aquatics. Speculation. We really don't know. The other challenge that you and I really have to understand about the lake is the question of flooding. Flooding on Chautauqua Lake is of historic record, and over on the easel I have pictures of a document that was created in 1980 as a document that I carried around the shores of the lake and put on everybody's doorstep or doorknob on the east side of the lake until I got chewed up by too many dogs. And then the rest of them I put in the local grocery stores. But this handout deals with the history of the Chautauqua Lake level, elevation, and flooding. The document is available through the county planning department, and anybody that is truly interested in the lake level and the potentials of what can happen on the lake, I strongly recommend that they call the Chautauqua County Department of Planning in Mayville and ask for a copy of the document. It's a handout, it's a fold-out, and it'll give you the lake management scheme for the water level. It discusses the incidence of flooding. But realize this, we have not experienced the maximum possible storm that could be placed in the watershed of Chautauqua Lake. The maximum possible storm is some 23 inches of rainstorm in 36 hours. It would happen in the summer. It would probably be some type of a tropical storm coming off the Gulf or up off of Cuba. Basically, though, the work that has been done with the federal flood insurance suggests to us that the difference between a 10-year incident and a 500-year incident of high water on the lake is a total of 1.1 feet. So it's not a significant thing. But realize that we're talking about frequency, and frequency is a mathematical probability, and when we talk about the maximum possible storm that could give us a lake elevation of 1319, something no one can conceive of, because in the time that I've known the lake, the most we've had is a 1313 elevation. That elevation happened in 1913 and again in 1918. Those incidences in both cases were spring freshets. Realize that the watershed in its totality can store up 4 to 6 inches of water in the snowpack, and then you get a February rain or a March rain, and that snowpack and the rain itself all come loose and come into the watershed. But never has it given us a lake elevation that exceeds much above 1313. Based on the work that we have done in the past, for people that are going to build around the shoreline of the lake in the future, my personal recommendation to you is don't build below an elevation of 1,313.5 feet. How do you identify that elevation? On a daily basis in the Post-Journal, usually on the second page, just before the obituaries, there is a daily almanac. And in that daily almanac, you have published down in the corner of it in its present format, you have the daily lake elevation. And I would suggest to you that when and if you are going to build around the shores of Chautauqua Lake, or someone is going to build around the shores of Chautauqua Lake, that they see what the stilled elevation was on that particular morning, and then put a tank or a tube out in front of their property and get their own stilled elevation, and then proceed to build above an elevation of 1,313.5 feet above mean sea level. And anybody that's going to remodel that is now has a home below that level, I would strongly recommend that they, as they remodel, they build to that new elevation. It's in the Post-Journal, Daily Almanac, almost every day. As Devin Taylor says, some days they miss it. That's true, but it doesn't happen very often. The last thing that I want to talk about, and I can disappear into this one, is what's going to happen on the surface activity of the lake. As more and more properties are built, the question is, will the undeveloped property of today become developed property of tomorrow, and will it be developed in a different manner? Realize that most of the recent development around the lake in the last 2 decades has taken place in depth. Point Chautauqua, Crosswinds, Chedwells, the development in the town of Ellery, and right now it slips Cedar Crest. These are in-depth developments. They're not just shoreline developments. There's not much left in the way of raw shoreline except in the quasi-public holdings and the public holdings of the lake. The biggest owner of lakefront on Chautauqua Lake is the state of New York. That includes Long Point State Park, the fish hatchery, Tom's Point, and the boat landing at Bemis Point. The next biggest owner is the village of Mayville with its lakefront park. And then we go down rapidly in terms of number, the village of Lakewood, the village of Cellaround, the town of Ellicott, the village of Bemis Point. The town of Chautauqua, the town of North Harmony, the town of Bustye, and the town of Ellery have road frontages into the lake. There's about 100 of them, and each road frontage has a different set of restrictions on it as to whether or not the road frontage is a public road or it is a private development road, and only certain people have access to it. So the question is, what is the future surface use of the lake going to be? Very simple. I believe, as it is now, that on 4th of July weekend and Labor Day weekend, stay off the lake. There are just too many people that want to get on the lake. But I would also suggest to you that in the middle of July, on a Wednesday afternoon, if you're out sailing on a sailboat and you don't have a life vest on, and you fall overboard, and the rest of the people partying on the boat don't notice that you've fallen overboard, you could perish out there. There aren't that many people on the lake on Wednesday. However, on Saturday or Sunday or Friday evening, you may end up with propeller tracks up and down your back. But only on certain weekends. As future activity takes place, we're going to have to discuss, as they have in many other places in the nation, whether or not use activity may be restricted on the lake. But I think that's well down the road. That's decades down the road before that will happen. Realize that one of the most exciting and most passive uses of the lake is just looking at it and enjoying it. And then there's another group of people that are just coming along that are really thrilled about the lake. They're thrilled about the lake in the area of Burtis Bay. They're thrilled about the lake at the mouth of Bemis Creek. And they're thrilled about the lake in the vicinity of Hartfield, and if you can get down in along the shore of Chautauqua Institution and drive along the shoreline there, in the spring of the year, in the fall of the year, you get your migratory waterfowl. And you would be surprised at the number of people that are now absolutely entranced by that activity, going out and looking. These birds are moving, of course. They start, as an example, the first migratory birds that I spotted this year, about the 15th of August, a family of loons came down from the north, a pa and 3 little ones, and they're on their way south already. The birds are there until it ices up, and sometimes the outlet of the lake doesn't ice up, and we get quite an accumulation east of the village of Celeron in the outlet of the lake. Ice up is an important time. And then if you are on the lake the day the ice goes out, come back the next day and you'll find mallard ducks, pairs of them, about 100 meters apart, all the way around the shore of the lake, the whole shoreline of the lake. And they're already going in to find a nest. However, in March you'll find that the birds in the outlet already have young. And maybe the ice hasn't gone out on the rest of the lake at that time. But the surface use is going to be a challenge. The activities, the types of vessels that we're allowed to use, we're going to discuss more and more. The noise level. There are people now that would like to see Chautauqua Lake made into a migratory waterfowl preserve and have hunting taken off of that. The wide range. There are others of us. I was once a great duck hunter on Chautauqua Lake and used to enjoy a wonderful afternoon of duck hunting and picking up my limit without any problem. The duck populations are coming back. We have a resident Canadian goose population that is of such size that we now have a resident goose hunt throughout most of the state of New York. These things will change. Boating, we're going to see, I think in the not too distant future, something about noise level of motors. When John Bentley was sheriff, he was not too interested in it. I don't know that Joe Gerasi has the time and the resources to be interested in it, but I think those of us around the watershed that live on the shore of the lake would like to see something done about noise levels on the lake. Based on some work that has just been completed by the planning department, there is the issue of the wave rider and the danger of that vehicle and the noise that that vehicle brings to us. Then we have the conflict between the fisherman and the sailboater. And if you look at the navigational laws, it's settled in those documents as to who has the right of way. And anybody that is using the surface waters of the lake should have enough sense to understand the navigational laws of the state of New York. There are several organizations around the shores of the lake that will provide you with the rules and regulations dealing with surface activity on the lake. The biggest piece of time that people take from the lake is just enjoying its serenity most of the time. Those are of us that live on the easterly side of the lake just have a wonderful time looking at a fall sunset or any time of year sunset. Those that live on the east side deal with the question of dawn and dawn activities. It's your lake, it's my lake, we can protect it. The future of the lake is bright if we respect its geological history and what we have in the lake at this time. There is no reason why the quality of the water for swimming, for drinking, for boating should deteriorate. In matter of fact, there is no reason why we shouldn't be able to improve the quality of the water in Chautauqua Lake to a higher level than it is today. The matter of fact is that maybe the zebra mussel will do it for us. Only time will tell. This is the beginning of our outdoor tour of interesting points in the Chautauqua Lake watershed. And one of the most interesting elements about the Chautauqua Lake watershed is that the upper reaches of it are part of the Continental Divide. And we've looked at all of the sites that crossroads that we could use as a Continental Divide, and we've decided that this site, 3/4 of a mile east of Route 394, north of Mayville, on the Bogene Road, is the place to explain the Continental Divide. To the north, we look at the Bogene Pond, which was on the 1954 U.S. geological maps, and to the south of the road, we look at the pond which Neil Johnson built after the 1954 USGS maps were made. The USGS map indicated that there was a culvert under the road. I can find no culvert under the road, so that I would suggest to you that if you were to go throw a bottle of water in Neil Johnson's pond, you've started water on its way to the Gulf of Mexico. And if we were to throw a bottle of water into the pond to the north, which I call the Bogene Pond, your bottle of water is on its way to the Atlantic Ocean. The Bogene Road, from this point up to the hilltop in each direction, does the best job of describing a continental divide that we can find in the northern reaches of the Chautauqua Lake watershed. It's an unusual place. It's not as dramatic as those that you find in the Rocky Mountains, but you are able to look into two different watersheds if you stand here at this point on the Bogene Road in the town of Chautauqua. Both of these ponds, by the way, are loaded, when they are open, are loaded with migratory birds in the spring and the fall of the year. And in the middle of August, if you get out here early enough in the morning and look particularly up in the Bogene Pond where there are a lot of logs, you can count turtles beyond number. Nothing but the still quiet of winter is with us at this point. After all those vehicles went by. We are now looking across Chautauqua Lake to Point Chautauqua from the village park, the village of Mayville, immediately east of the railroad station. If we were to get into a time machine and drop back to the year 1860, we would find that we were standing out in Chautauqua Lake. This area between here and the street has been totally filled in. We're going to pan around to the Hartfield Bay area of the lake, and eventually, as we do that panning, realize that we had docks extending out into the lake for steamboat operation in the 1890s. We went out as much as 350 feet, and a dock might be 50 feet wide. The biggest enemy of the docking facilities was the spring freshet, and we learned this in recent history when we again tried to build a permanent dock, and in 2 years the spring ice came off and took the dock out. It was also one of the problems that the railroads had when they first built through here, that the ice, when the ice would come out, would pile up on the railroad track. The willow trees that you see were planted of recent history, 1925. As we scan to the Erie Street and we come up onto a gas station and Jambrone Seafood House, if you can imagine, 1886 and 1887 the railroads came through, and the first hotel built on the lake as part of the railroad lake attraction was the Chautauqua House. It was built with 66 rooms, and eventually in its multi-story wooden construction had 132 rooms in it. As we continue to pan around to the left, we come upon the recently built railroad station that was constructed in 1925 to replace the original wooden construction which had burned several years earlier. Because of the action of the ice out drama on the lake, which by the way is the biggest action, natural action against that creates erosion around the shores, we realize that all of this area has been raised a number of feet above the original construction of the railroad in 1886 and 87 because of that eroding force of the ice. As we pan further around, we come to the Chautauqua Belle, which is of recent vintage on the lake, the only large vessel now plying the lake. And we come to the Mayville Village Park, which was the site of a very large ice house industry during the 1880s and 1890s. When the railroads came, there was a tremendous ice industry here. And this is recorded in a pamphlet that is available at the Mayville Library, done by Willis Rothra on the ice industry. I was talking about the railroad coming through Mayville. It's the years 1867 to 1868 that the railroad comes through Mayville. We don't see any other dynamic railroad activity until 1902, about a decade after Edison comes up with his central power generation theory, and all of a sudden we get the explosion of trolley lines all over the United States. Between 1902 and 1905, an electric trolley line is built up the west side of the lake and all the way to the village of Westfield. And the remnant that we have of it is the entrance gate and structure to Chautauqua Institution. Basically, the vast majority of the structure related to the trolley business coming up from Jamestown and coming down from Mayville and bringing passengers from the electric lines. The interesting thing that happens, of course, is that the trolley lines begin to compete with the steamboats, and we see a dynamic drop in the number of vessels on the lake as the trolley line serves the west side of the lake. By 1925, the line is discontinued. But its remnant, the entrance to Chautauqua County, remains to this date. We are looking down lake from in front of the Athenaeum at Chautauqua Institution. A stop on Chautauqua Lake or a discussion of Chautauqua Lake would not be complete without the institution as part of the story. But we're going to pan so that you can see what the view looks like. We're passing along Long Point State Park at this point and coming up lake. And the first large building that you can see is the skating rink at Midway Park. We then go by the private homes of the Welches and scan up lake. Along the way we have the quasi-public holdings, the Chedwell development, Crosswinds, DeWittville Bay with the Y Camp, and finally into Tinkertown Bay, and we come then immediately to the Miller Bell Tower at Chautauqua Institution. The building that you see in front of the bell tower, of course, is the point at which all of the steamers landed for a number of decades during the 1870s to 1930 was the last time we really saw any activity in terms of carrying passengers. As we scan by the landscape, we begin to get a little bit of the flavor of Chautauqua Institution. We could spend days talking about the various buildings, but the most important and most impressive building in my book is the Athenaeum, constructed in 1881. It's one of the two hotels left from the great days of the motel and steamboat history of Chautauqua Lake. In the summertime, you can almost see the ladies with their parasols and their broad-brimmed hats and their flowing gowns walking on the balcony of the Athenaeum. This building, by the way, was modernized by the Chautauqua County Industrial Development Agency in the 1980s. It was modernized. A most impressive wooden structure. Some of the wooden structures that were built around the shores of the lake were larger than this, but this is one of two that remain from that wonderful and exciting era of the 1880s, 90s, and turn of the century. We're looking up into Bemis Bay from just south of the Stowe Ferry, and we're going to pan in an easterly direction so that you can see the ferry as it now exists. And as you do that, you can look into the background and see the village of Bemis Point. Realize that the ferry was the first commercial vessel running on a daily basis on Chautauqua Lake. It started in 1811 as a private endeavor, eventually to be taken over by the Chautauqua County Board of Supervisors and run as part of the county highway system. And then with the completion of the Southern Tier Expressway, it was taken off of the county highway system and is now being run by the Chautauqua Lake Historic Vessels Group. As we look to the south, of course, we can see the Chautauqua Lake Bridge. We've talked about that previous sessions. Realize that the majority of the pilings do not go down to bedrock. They are friction pilings, and it is the friction on the side of the pilings that holds the bridge as it is. The bridge was designed in order with enough height so that the E-scows and the Chautauqua Belle could pass underneath it. That became the criteria for the height of the bridge. One of the other things that is happening this time of year, the lake is still open, and we have a substantial number of mallard ducks that live about the shores of the lake. Many of the people along the shoreline feed them and enjoy them immensely. The day after ice out, these birds disperse to the rate of about one pair, which will attempt to nest about every 100 meters around the shore of the lake. We're at the north entrance to the Viewcoat Canal system. This is a development that blossomed as the railroad, the electric line, came up the east side, or the west side of Chautauqua Lake between 1902 and 1911. Today's rules and regulations would not allow this development to exist at all, because if you look at the 1902 map of the area, this is all designated as a wetland. From this point, we can look across Chautauqua Lake, out the mouth of the canal, to the John Cheney farm on the opposite side of the lake, and the location where we have the Southern Tier Expressway rest stop and view opportunity from the western side of the lake. And if we move down on the other side of the canal a little bit, we can look up lake and see the Chautauqua Lake Bridge. But you'll notice that the Chautauqua Lake Bridge is not a horizon element. It's hidden down in the horizon because of its height. As we pan around, we can look into the canal system. Realize that this land speculation, created in the early part of this century, was predicated on lots 135 feet deep by 35 feet wide, which meant that in order for it to be a safe place, you needed public water and sewer. But there was no sewers in this particular area until the South Chautauqua Lake Sewer District was created. Water system came out much earlier. It was necessary, and you can see that these homes even today are not that much above the lake level. The lake level this morning was 1307.8 feet above mean sea level, and so you can see that this particular area of the shoreline of Chautauqua Lake in the storm and spring freshet of March of 1976, all of these properties had water around their foundation. The fact of the matter is that there were 845 properties with water around the foundation of the houses. And that was a 100-year storm. And we have other frequencies of storms, so that there is a future for these people to have wet floors if we get an inordinately difficult summer storm. The Viewcoat Canal area, an area which would not have been allowed to be developed if a permit was asked for in 1995. We're at the end of Dunham Avenue in the village of Celeron, at what is now the Celeron Park, and we're looking down the outlet of the lake. And as Devin pans, we'll go by Bonita, which was a development that was started with the railroad as it went up the east side of the lake in the 1880s, and look across the lake at the development. In all instances, these properties were developed on dimensioned lots that under urban design criteria would say that they should have public water and sewer, and they did not have either public water and sewer, and some of them still don't have public water. They received sewers in the late 70s or early 1980s. As Devin scans up lake and begins to look at the south shore, we come on to the remnants of the Celeron Amusement Park. I would strongly suggest that you look at the trolley booklet by Fenton and the hotel booklet, and you'll see what these places looked like about the turn of the century. We're looking across the lake at the extension of the end of Dunham Avenue in the village of Celeron, and realize that in the early 1900s there was a railroad trestle with the trolley lines that went almost halfway across the lake at this point, and where the steamships would come up, and then the people would get on the steamships to take their trips up lake. They said that it was a time element, that the people didn't want to ride up the outlet of the lake. I believe that it may also have been a loading issue as far as the steamboats were concerned, but we don't find much of that in the literature. We're standing on the Jones and Gifford Bridge over the outlet of Chautauqua Lake, and on the east side of the outlet we find what used to be the railroad stations and trolley stations, and as we scan in a northerly direction and across the outlet of the Chautauqua Lake, which is now the Chautauqua River, we find the remnants of the turning basins for the steamboats. And if you want to see what this looks like when it is in full activity, look at the steamboat document published by the Fenton Historical Society. This used to be an extremely active place with as many as 8 large steamboats docked in this area. Now, of course, it is a memorial park maintained by the city of Jamestown. We're standing just upstream of the Washington Street Bridge and looking down, and going to scan for you the upstream side of Warner Dam. Realize that this is the 3rd dam that has been erected in this area. The first dam was erected in, the 4 dams have been erected in this area. Prendergast built one in 1811 and then rebuilt one in 1812 and 1813. In 1919, a new Warner Dam was dedicated just upstream of the existing dam, and it stayed until the 1980s, and the state of New York reconstructed this dam for the people of Chautauqua County a little bit out from beyond the ice and snow fall off of the Washington Street Bridge. The dam is on this side does not look very awesome. We will move to the downstream side so you can see that there is almost a 7-foot fall in water through the dam at this time of year. Lake elevation is 1307.8 this morning, according to the Post-Journal. We are on the downstream side of Warner Dam now. In the background you can see the Washington Street Bridge. From this side you can see the 3 Tainter gates. The capacity of the dam has the capacity to pass 6,000 cubic feet per second. However, at 1,720 cubic feet per second, the development in the village of Faulkner begins to suffer flood damage. Today the lake elevation is 1307.8. At that elevation, because of the constriction above the 3rd Street Bridge, we are passing less than 1,000 cubic feet per second down through the channel. In fact, it may be down to as much as 800 feet. This, even though only one of the dam gates is open. Later on in the year, for public relation purposes, they may open more than one gate, but it is not necessary that more than one gate be open to maintain the flow down the Chautauqua River itself. Realize that in the summertime, these gates are closed to the point that only somewhere between 20 and 60 cubic feet per second pass, and that is necessary in order to hold the summer lake elevation of Chautauqua Lake. The most important function that Warner Dam has is the maintaining of the summer lake elevation. If we were to remove Warner Dam from the Chautauqua River, the summer elevation of the lake would drop down to somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,303 feet, some 5 feet lower than the minimum elevation we would like to see for our summer experience. We're at Dow Street now. The reason for coming to Dow Street is to show you the elevation of the river and the flume that is used to measure the flow of the Chautauqua River. We're now almost 50 feet down in elevation from the top of Warner Dam. And as you can see, as we would pan out upstream here, we do have a little flooding of the neighboring lands of the Chautauqua River. We're going to cross Dow Street and look downstream, and you'll get an idea of how constricted we have made the river. In earlier presentations I noted that the river is now somewhere between a quarter and a third of what its original cross-section was when the Holland Land Company first did its survey through this area. So we'll step across the road now and look at the downstream flume and measuring device that gives us the measurements of the outflow of Chautauqua Lake and the Chautauqua River. Here we are at the measuring flume. Realize that we've come by a place called Piusville, and we've passed Slippery Rock, which are places that are mentioned in Hazeltine's history of the town of Ellicott and mentioned many times by the historians. Notice how wide the river is at this point. Again, as I noted earlier, we have come down in river elevation almost 50 feet. By the time we get to the Work Street Bridge in Faulkner, the river bottom has dropped 50 feet. And so we have this flow. We're probably at a flow of somewhere between 700 and 1,000 cubic feet per second. The best we can take in terms of flow without damaging abutting property in the village of Faulkner is 1,720 cubic feet. These stations can be interrogated by telephone at any time so that we can know what the flow down the Chautauqua is and what the Chautauqua Lake elevation is. This material is recorded on a 15-minute interval, and we can do all kinds of statistical analysis of what is happening down the river and at the lake. We're standing at the boat launch site owned and operated by the state of New York at Bemis Point. The site at one time was a fish hatchery, and prior to that it had a record as being an Indian burial ground. And no matter where you look throughout Oriental Park and the village of Bemis Point, we're dealing with an area that is rich in Indian artifacts if one is going to spend any time digging to any depth. In the park itself, at the casino, there are 32 inches of stratified Indian remains. We're going to scan around through part of Oriental Park and Bemis Point and out and look at the Chautauqua Lake Veterans Memorial Bridge, and underneath it we can see these other south shores of Chautauqua Lake. We've been very fortunate today with the weather on the second day of December. Here, of course, the bridge becomes an element in the skyline, but I would suggest to you that while it spoiled some people's appreciation of the lake as they owned it prior to the bridge, the new people coming are still keeping the property values as they would have been because there is so much demand for lake frontage. When we get to the westerly shore, we can actually scan back, and when you get to the area where you can see the smoke rising, you can also see the Bemis Point Ferry. This happens to be one of the few places in the lake where we have controlled the surface of the lake, and there is a speed limit control from the bridge back and just beyond the ferry at Stowe to Bemis Point. As we scan further to the right, we come upon a very small concrete building. This building is the gauging station for measuring Chautauqua Lake elevation. It was funded by county and U.S. geological funds, and part of it was out of the program resulting from Tropical Storm Agnes in June of 1972. This gauge station has been online since 1974, and all measurements that you read in the Post-Journal are taken at this point. The gauge may be interrogated by telephone, and that number, of course, is not listed. The only people that use the telephone and the gauging station are the Board of Public Utilities, who by default have had to operate Warner Dam, and by the County Planning Department and the U.S. Geological Survey. This is the Hotel Lenhardt in Bemis Point. This is the second Lenhardt, built in 1891. One of the only two wooden hotels left as part of the great era of 1870 to 1910. As you scan across, we scan across this way and scan over towards the casino, realize that we are scanning an area that was very actively used by Native Americans for centuries. And the fact is that we've done some archaeological digs here and can go down 32 inches with Indian signs and relics, potsherds, fire-cracked rock, and flint instruments. We then scan out across the Stowe Ferry site and into Bemis Bay, and the onshore facility that we're going to scan by right now is where the Chautauqua Belle ties up for part of the summer. Off in the distance is the marina for Long Point State Park, and then we begin to come into the private development to the south of the park and into the village of Bemis Point. One of the most unusual things that happens on Chautauqua Lake is every once in a while one is fortunate enough to see and catch some of the biggest fish, freshwater fish of the North American continent, that being the muskellunge. Today we're going to talk about how I was taught to fish for muskellunge in Chautauqua Lake. Realize that most of my fishing was done in the northern half of the lake, and we'll look at the bottom of the lake as part of my assistance in this process a little later on in the tape. I thought at one time I was going to title this presentation Fishing for Muskellunge as Taught to Me by Old Timers. And then when I began looking at the people that taught me how to fish, I found out that there were only two old timers. The rest of the people were contemporaries. The old timers were my father-in-law, Don Appleyard from Jamestown, who has had a family cottage up at just north of Woodland since the turn of the century, and a fellow by the name of Willis Rothra, an ice fisherman, a fisherman in general, a very kind and gentle soul. And the thing that I would like you to understand about fishing on Chautauqua Lake is that it's not just fishing for fish. And the best way to express that is a poem written by Willis a number of years ago.
My Friend the Lake by Willis H. Rothra. I sit in silent reverence as I gaze upon the lake and ask the Lord a few years' grace before my soul he takes. A scene of unmatched beauty as I view the rising sun and reminisce about the days when I was very young. With boyhood dreams I play again in the sand like yellow gold, with never once a single thought that someday I'd grow old. The lake has been my pulpit, where, without a spoken word, I give my thanks for many things to the one we call our Lord. When I'm in need of solace, that friend is always there. When pain or mental suffering seems more than I can bear, I ask that friend to comfort me and help me through the fight. A word comes back from somewhere that everything's all right. Preachers say that I'm all wrong, that I should pray with them. I know that they have been ordained, but still they are only men. So I'll go on with my pagan ways and worship with my friend. I've lived my life upon this lake, and there my days I'll end.
Thank you, Devin. There was no way that I could read that poem. The reason I pick Willis Rothra is that he was the man that taught me the secret of what may be a disappearing art, and that is live baiting for muskellunge on Chautauqua Lake. And I'm going to start with that portion of the activity and show you some of the equipment that is used for live baiting. Some of the equipment may be used for other things also, but the first thing that a live baiter has to have and decide on is the type of pole he wants. I have seen live bait poles that have been 10 and 12 feet long, and at the thinnest end they've been a ½ inch in diameter. Bamboo, no give, just a huge long stick. Both of these put in holders on each side of a rowboat and cast out to troll for the muskellunge. Let me show you what I was taught was the standard rigging for a muskellunge live bait fishing experience. And I'll take the pole that I use now for that purpose and show it to you. It happens to be an old level wind reel, the level wind reel that I caught my first muskellunge on, as a matter of fact. My first muskellunge was caught after fishing the lake for 10 summers, 1 week at a time with my father-in-law. And I did get a fish up to the side of the boat once in those 10 summers. But the first year that I lived on Chautauqua Lake and in Chautauqua County, on October 3rd, 1960, you can tell it was an outstanding day, late in the afternoon, I went out on the lake and noticed that there were a whole number of people fishing for muskellunge up in the northern end of the lake. And then I realized that there was a white fly hatch coming up, and chasing the white fly hatch were a bunch of silver-sided fish, different characters and quantities. And as I spent the afternoon out there, I began to realize that I was the only boat that had not had a muskellunge up to the side of the boat. And finally I cast out with this particular pole and reel, and I thought I was in the weeds. And I cranked in with, I happened to have on a jointed minnow pikey with a sharp bill on it, and all of a sudden I got the weeds up so that I could see that it wasn't a weed. It turned out to be one of God's great creatures, a 48.5-inch, 30-pound muskellunge. I've never caught another one that large. And also understand that my fish has not grown. Nominally, fish after they've been caught and years after they've been caught seem to take on bigger proportion. But this was only 48.5 inches, a level wind reel with a simple minnow pikey on it and about 20-pound test line. But to live baiting. Live baiting rig starts with a special hook and leader and swivel, and there goes part of it on the floor. But the hook allows you to put it through the lower and upper lip of a creek chub or a horn dice or a 7 or 8 inch perch. And then what you need are a series of bobbers. And I'll have to chase one of them. At about 6 feet out from the hook, depending upon how deep you're going to fish on a particular day, you put on the first bobber. It's a small bobber. It's not going to irritate the fish at all when he picks up your bait and decides to swallow it. So now we've got 6 feet of line out. We're going to take another 6 feet of line out. And up there, we're going to put another bobber. In everybody's life, a little rain must fall. In this case, it was the microphone. We'll try and see if we can do a better job now. So at 12 feet out, we put another bobber. The equipment is still available for those of you that are interested. It just so happens that my brother didn't like the white bobbers that I'd been using for years, and therefore he put together some orange bobbers for me. These are nothing more than rings that you can buy in the hardware store. Now I'm ready. I've got one bobber at 12 feet, another bobber at 6 feet. Now this 6-foot bobber might be in 8 feet instead of 6 feet. It depends upon where you're going to do your live baiting. Traditionally, before the loss of the weed bed in the northern part of Chautauqua Lake, I used to fish on just the outside of the weed bed, which would be, depending upon the material on the bottom of the lake, somewhere around 10 feet. And this was an ideal setup. And what you would do, you would put one pole out on each side of the boat, your rowboat. By the way, in most instances, this type of fishing was done in the late evening or at night. And so there was other equipment that you needed. You needed a set of bow lights with a green and red light. You needed a white light behind you. You needed a headlight. You needed a life vest. By the way, if you ever go out on the lake, wear your life vest. I don't care what you're doing. If you're in a boat, wear a life vest. It's very good insurance. Anyway, you get out on the lake and you then start to slowly roll. And one of the most important things about the various poles and reels that were used in live baiting was that it had to have a click that made noise. Without a click that made noise, fishing in the dark at night became a very difficult task. I have borrowed another type of pole and reel, and the outstanding feature of this reel, as far as I am concerned, is it has a beautiful click on it. And you set the tension of the click so that you can row slowly. And when I say slowly, I'm talking about less than a mile an hour. And you row, and you row, and you row, and you row until all of a sudden, even if it's in the dark of night, you begin to hear your reel doing this. You stop rowing. You rest a moment, and then you start rowing backwards and looking for your bobbers on whichever pole the action was taken. And nominally what you find is the 12-foot bobber is still on the surface. And in many instances it's laying flat. Very rarely it's standing up in the water. But the little bobber you're not going to find. Because what has happened is the muskellunge has taken it down, and he's now either holding the bait sideways in his mouth, or he's already got it partially in his gullet, or in his mouth only. And you want to wait until you know that he has taken the hook. Ooh. And he's got the hook in the mouth so that when you go to set it, you're going to hook him. The vast majority of instances when I have live bait fished, the fish has been hooked in the mouth. On one occasion, the fish had already started to take the creek chub or the horn dice or the perch down, and I caught it in its gullet. And in another case, the fish had already put the bait all the way into its stomach, and when we set the hook, we actually set it in its spine, and it caused it to come up in a humped condition. 38-inch fish, however, which gives you quite a nice set of muskellunge fillets for smoking or broiling or whatever you want to do with them. That's the secret of live baiting, the patience, afternoon, evening. I can tell you stories. I ought to tell you a story about a neighbor up the lake. He'd been there for years and years and years, and he really wasn't an old-timer. He was a contemporary. And Chuck went out one afternoon, late in the afternoon in September. Live baiting is basically a fall activity. It's not a summer activity. And he went out, and he put over one live bait rig over one side of the boat, and he put the live bait rig over the other side of the boat. I happened to be standing on shore, maybe at the most 200 feet from him as he was rigging up. And all of a sudden he says, "Damn!" And he began to work one rig. And he had a fish on it. And he pulled it in. It was a 27-inch walleye pike. And of course, he was very happy to get a 27-inch walleye. And he put it in the boat. And he looked around and he said, "Damn!" And the other rig had gone down. And he started to play that in. And all of a sudden, he got a little action. And Chuck Skinner, in 20 minutes of late afternoon fishing, caught a 38-inch muskellunge and a 27-inch walleye pike. He said, "There went the rest of the evening and the night. What am I going to do?" And that was it for Chuck that particular day. One other live bait fishing experience that I enjoyed immensely was with my daughter Sally. She would go out fishing with me sometimes. And sometimes what we would do is we'd take the live bait rigs and we'd let them drag behind us as we did bait casting. And this particular afternoon, again, a fall afternoon, very few of us are on the lake, and Sally decided that she wanted to go fishing, and I said, "Boy, that's wonderful," and so we went. And one of the things that I often told my children was, when you're cold, I don't know it unless you tell me. And after about 2.5 hours of drifting around parts of Hartfield Bay, Sally said to me, "Dad, I'm cold. It's time to go home." We had drifted from about the mouth of the big inlet down to the old Woodland dock and piling area on the eastern shore of the lake, along basically the edge of the weeds on the outer edge at that particular time. I said, "Okay, let's put it away." And then I looked out at our two live bait rigs that were behind us, and I said, "Sally, we're not going home. We've got a problem. Your rig has the small bobber is gone. We're going to have to creep back up on it. We rode back up on it. It so happened that she was using this particular pole at the time, and as you can see, it's an old, tired Shakespeare reel. They don't make them like this anymore. They make beautiful, beautiful new monsters that you can do all kinds of things with. Anyway, I said, we're going to row back, and we're going to take off the top bobber, because we could see the top bobber was laying flat on the top of the lake. I said, we're going to take off the top bobber, and then we're going to look for the little bobber. So I took the top bobber off, and I said, now, what I want you to do, I'm going to settle in the bottom of the boat, and we're going to get right up. You can see the little bobber. It's about 1.5 feet under the water. You be prepared when we get over it to strike. Well, I'll tell you what happened when she struck. The pole went like this. And I said, we're in trouble. Oh boy, are we in trouble. And I whooped and I hollered and I shouted, and she kept saying, Daddy, there's people that can hear you. Don't make so much noise. And she coolly fought this fish for about 20 minutes before it decided to come up, and we boated it. It was a 42-inch Muskellunge. We're talking about a fish in the 15 to 20 pound category. We saw a fisherman inshore, closer to the shore. We went in and I said, look at what my daughter caught, and she's acting like the coolest cat you've ever seen. We get back to the dock and she gets up and she sits down on the dock and she starts to shake. And all of the energy and all of the coolness that she had disappeared there for a moment or two. She just had the shakes all over. But that was a wonderful, wonderful time. Other fishing for muskellunge on Chautauqua Lake. I was taught by a group that basically had their headquarters in the Hotel Holland. So you can think of names like Clarence Kircher, Dick Frank, and a number of other people. And they taught me various ways to fish. And one of the things that happens is that you've got to understand what part of the lake I did most of my fishing in. So if the camera crew can pan up to the map of the northern end of Chautauqua Lake, I can show you the terrain and the topography of the bottom of the lake that plays a role in how we did our fishing. Most of the gentlemen that I fished with had depth finders on their boat. Here you can see the northern end of the lake. Basically, we fished from the bell tower at Chautauqua Institution northward. On rare occasion, we would go beyond that point, but most of the time, this was our fishing area. We like to fish in along the edge of the littoral zone, which is that area in which we have rooted aquatics, and then we would fish out at various depths. Notice that the lake bottom in this area is a plane that shapes up from a point between the bell tower and Dwittville Bay. It gradually is a long slope up towards the northern end of the lake. In the vast majority of instances when we trolled with light rigs. By light rigs, I mean we didn't use 40 and 50 pound test line and 3-ounce keel sinkers and that type of thing. In most instances, we fished with lures that had a diving capability, and we fished with lead core lines. Total metal lines were outlined a number of years ago, but lead core lines are still allowable today. And we used different types of baits. I can show you these, and some of you will recognize them as bombers of different categories. Lazy ikes, flatfish of various sizes, all the way. The smallest flatfish that I ever caught a lunge on is this X4. I happened to catch a lunge just outside of Prendergast Point one day on a 6-pound test line, back when you could keep a 33-inch lunge on that small a bait. I also had encountered muskellunge when I've been fishing for perch that I was going to use for bait, for live baiting. In one instance, one day I'm out with a 7.5-foot cane pole, which is a very small thing, and I'm after about an 8-inch perch. And I get a sunfish on it, and as I'm pulling it up on the inside of the weed line, this lunge comes and grabs it sideways in its mouth. I was able to reach for the net, but just about the time I dipped the net under the fish, he opened his mouth and went away. I might tell you another thing that's very important about muskellunge fishing. Check your equipment every day. Check your snaps, check your swivels. I have only lost one muskellunge because of improperly used equipment or worn equipment. In this case, it happened to be a snap hook that I hadn't put all the way in and snapped it completely. And I had the lunge right up next to the boat, and it broke off and took the plug and disappeared. Another thing that I would mention to you is a plug called a swick, which is a plug that is 8.5 inches long. It basically is a surface lure, and when the fishermen fish with it, and they crank with it, and they pull it, and it dives down in the water and then slowly floats up. I have found 6 dead muskellunge over the 30 years that I've fished Chautauqua Lake with swicks caught someplace in their throat, outside of their throat, or in their mouths. I have not found any other lures in dead muskellunge. I found muskellunge, spring freshet is a wonderful time to check the lake. I can remember one year coming upon a pair of muskellunge lying on the side of the lake. The big fish was probably 40 inches. The small fish was probably 25 inches, and what had happened was the muskellunge had swallowed the other muskellunge, and it had started to swim out of its gill, and they both perished. Now, if you want to see that action in life, you can see it by going to the fish hatchery when they have the small fry, and the small fry are eating their fellow fry. So a muskellunge is not afraid of attacking anything when it's hungry. On the board, there is a picture of my 2 brothers holding muskellunge. This happened to be a day in September. We'd been on Dick Johnson's boat in the south part of the lake, and we'd come up under the bridge. Before we reached the bridge, my brother Jim caught his fish, and as we got up about the area of the bell tower, my brother Dick caught his fish. Those 2 fish jointly, well, this isn't my 2 fishing buddies. This is my brother Dick and I with about a 40-inch muskellunge that I caught at some other time. But there is a picture there of both of my brothers holding fish and smiling from ear to ear. It happened to be on Dick Johnson's boat. It happened to be a late September, early October fishing outing. I was the guide. Dick Johnson was the captain of the vessel. My brother Jim, with the hat on, caught his fish below the bridge. My brother Dick caught his fish somewhere near the bell tower. We're talking about a combined weight of 53 pounds. We happened to pass Spike Kelder House that particular day, and I held up both fish and I said, "Hey, Spike, is this what you're out there for today?" And of course, we were just happier than you could believe. The fish that my brother had, that Jim had, which was the lighter colored of the 2 fish, had a 15-inch catfish in its gut when we cleaned it. It had just started to digest the fish. So you get an idea of when these fish are on the prowl. Hold that picture for a moment also, because I want you to look at the fin on this fish, or the fins on this fish, and you'll see that they're very red and stressed. This was 1983, and it was probably at the top of the dollar spot infection that we had on the muskellunge of Chautauqua Lake. It was a glorious day. We talk about it continuously. But to you, the person that might be interested in fishing on Chautauqua Lake, don't be afraid to use any type of a plug that meets your fancy. I'm going to tell you that I've lost only 1 lunge. I've never had a line break on me because I make sure I have good new line every year or every other year, depending upon what the line is. I've fished for muskellunge with as light as 6-pound test line, and I know that some of the men that fish Chautauqua Lake that are members of muskellunge fishing organizations may even fish with lighter equipment than that. It used to be that on an afternoon I could say to somebody, let's go out and do some lunge fishing, and the least I'll be able to provide you with is a follow-up to the boat of a muskellunge. However, the whole system of the lake has gone through a dynamic change since the early 70s. We've seen a change in the nutrient loading. We've seen a change in the weed community. We've seen the introduction of fish into the lake that weren't there, as far as we know, in earlier years. And the muskellunge population has declined. However, the state of New York, in its wisdom, has suggested that we now only keep a lunge if it's over 40 inches. The reason for this is very simple. The female muskellunge were growing so rapidly in the lake that they are often being caught as legal fish at 32 inches before they had spawned. And so we were taking our brood stock away. And they immediately moved to 40-inch fish. Now, I know the person that decided that we should not keep anything under 40 inches has never tried to disconnect himself from a 38-inch muskellunge and not harm either himself or the fish. I fish basically with this type of a pole as a trolling pole. I've tried longer poles, but the longer the pole gets, the more the pole reacts with the action of the lure, and you don't get the type of action that you want. The lure of my choice in most instances is a flatfish. This means that you have to troll at somewhere between 2.7 miles an hour and 3.1 mile an hour. Otherwise, the flatfish will come out of the water. With lead core line, it's marked every 10 yards, and every 10 yards of line that I let out, this lure goes down 3 feet. How do I know that? Because time after time I have tested it and deliberately dug the plug into the bottom of the lake and noted the elevation that I was at with my depth finder at that particular time. We fish basically flatfish. We basically fish with yellow, chartreuse, red and orange. However, if you put a plug in front of a fish when he's hungry, he doesn't care or she doesn't care. And when I say he, she, realize that I've caught very few male muskellunge that are more than 35 inches long. After you pass 35 inches, 36 inches, and start up into the 40 inches, you're going to catch, the fish is going to be a female muskellunge. Put them back? I don't know. A lot of people are putting fishing and releasing them. Every once in a while I like to harvest a fish. I did last year, or the year before last, I took one that I kept. It happened to turn out to make beautiful smoked fillets, and we served them at a number of gatherings, and people enjoyed them immensely. Fact of the matter is, at one of the county officers' associations, we took 3 muskellunge from the lake to the eastern part of the state and treated the people to smoked muskellunge, which is a wonderful treat. In closing, I would say to you that have not handled a muskellunge correctly, and by handling it correctly, I mean you catch it, you take it home, you dress it, you clean it, you cool it. You've spoiled a very, very good dinner. You can broil it, you can fry it, you can bake it, and as long as you don't eat the fat that is associated with the flesh of the fish, it is as good as halibut. It's as good as salmon. It can't quite beat a fillet of perch, but it's good eating if you handle it right. And I strongly, strongly invite you to try and catch one of those 40 inchers. And if you're not going to eat it, if you're just going to brag on it, take a picture of it and release it back to the lake so that some other people can enjoy the privilege of catching one of those beautiful fish. That's it for today. Catch a fish.